Hi, let's talk about sweet feed. Now, those of us who were keeping horses in the late 80s, early 90s will tell you that sweet feed, which came along during the 80s, was the big thing. That's what everybody fed their horse, and they were tremendously popular. Over the years, they have slightly lost their popularity for a number of reasons, and we'll talk about those. But the thing to remember about a sweet feed, the term sweet feed really just refers to a mixture of grains and agricultural byproducts that has been treated with molasses. The sweet in the sweet feed is the molasses that gets put on it to give it the smell and the taste. And the reason why the molasses was put on was to bind the ingredients together, because molasses is sticky and the powdery dry grain would stick to the molasses. B, to make it smell good, because horses and humans judge a lot of their feed by the smell, and to make it taste good so that the horses would eat it. The horses would probably eat the ingredients if they didn't have the molasses, but the human who's paying the money to buy the bag thinks they look and smell so much better when they have molasses on them, that lovely shiny dark coating that you saw. The reason that the sweet feeds have lost their popularity is that we have become aware of problems of overfeeding sugar and starch to horses. And sweet feed, by its name, is indicating that it is sweet. Now, not all sweet feeds are as sweet as you think, because the molasses can smell a lot sweeter than it actually tastes. And I don't know how many of you have had blackstrap molasses or the old-fashioned molasses that they make molasses cookies out of. That stuff isn't very sweet. It smells rich. It smells like it should be. But when you taste it, you're like, ew, this isn't sweet at all. And that's something that people tend to forget. Some of the sweet feeds that were fed actually had less sugar in them than some of the non-sweet feeds. But because they smelt of the molasses, people associated them with sweetness, with sugar, with the taste. And this made people a little nervous to feed them because of the problems of horses with Cushing's or with a sensitivity to sugar. The other problem with sweet feeds is that they don't have a huge shelf life. Because it's just a mixture of the grains and the byproducts coated in molasses, it's not heat treated usually. It's just mixed and then poured into the bag. It deteriorates, particularly in hot months, and you can start to ferment, and you can get problems when animals eat fermented sweet feed. You can get botulism from sweet feed that sat around for too long. So you began to run into some health issues due to the fact that sweet feed was not in any way heat treated to preserve it. It was just mixed, it was just blended and poured in a bag, and you had to use it up within a certain length of time. The advent of modern pelleting. Now, modern pelleting, the pellet mill, the same ingredients that are in the sweet feed sometimes are put together, they're ground to a fine powder, they're mixed with water to make a slurry. So you see it when it flows down the pipe, it's like a semi-liquid slurry. It's heated sometimes to 200 degrees, and it's cooked. And then the hot slurry is forced out through a die, that's a ring that sits in the tube, has little holes in it. And the different size holes, different size pellets. It goes through the die, and as it comes out through the die, it cools and sets. And you would break off in the form of pellets. And this was a pelleted feed. And pelleted feeds had several advantages. One of them being, the main one being the heat treatment. The heat treatment killed the bacteria and the mold that was sitting on all the agricultural byproducts that were the ingredients, and rendered it temporarily sterile. So that it was not sterile, that's a little exaggerated, but it made it lower level of mold and bacteria, so that it was preserved. Cooking is a means of preservation. Cooking also changes the ingredients a little bit, some more than others, and they can become more or less digestible according to how they react to a heat treatment. And then the other big advantage of it was that you had a homogenized mix. You were grinding all the ingredients, you were mixing them together in a giant mixer. You would blend in some molasses because that molasses gave it a good smell, but it wouldn't need to be coated in molasses, so you wouldn't have as much. And then you have this homogeneous mixture that comes out that lasts a lot longer in the bag, and it's an even, steady, same color, same texture within the batch. Now each batch could be a little different. So you had a more consistent product, which for some people was important. And the main thing was you had a product that could sit in the bag for a lot longer before it started to deteriorate due to bacterial contamination or mold growth. And this extended the shelf life of the feed product considerably. The other thing you could do was you could use ingredients that maybe were not something they would eat raw, but because it was now cooked, and they were more palatable or they were safer for the animal to eat. So pelleting has replaced sweet feed in many cases. Now, in Europe, it's a little bit different. They made mixtures that were like a sweet feed, but they were a little different in appearance. They had more crimped, micronized rolled grains. They had less sugar beet pulp, less soybean meal. And they also have a much higher population on a smaller area, so that there wasn't the distribution issues, there wasn't sitting in the warehouse issues, the stuff was used up faster. So for them, sweet feed, or the mixtures, the horse mixes that they call them, they didn't call them sweet feeds, that's an American term, but they call them mixes. They were more successful in the European area because of the various things to do with marketing. But in the United States, the sweet feed lost its popularity. There are still some around. A lot of the older mills that don't have pelleting capacity have to make a sweet feed mix, or they have to buy in. If you were in an older mill that does not have a pelleting capacity, pelletizers are huge pieces of equipment, cost millions of dollars. So if you're a smallish feed mill, you may or may not have a pelleter. And if you don't have a pelleter, you can't make pellets. So you have to make a sweet feed. So in some parts of the country, sweet feeds still exist, they're still fed, they're still used. The bigger feed companies don't make them as much for the reasons that we discussed, because pelleting does extend the shelf life. And if you've got one mill and it's shipping bags out to 7, 8, 9, 10 states, so shelf life becomes an issue. But sweet feeds are still around. We now would call them a mix, usually, rather than a sweet feed. We took the European terminology. And they're still a good feed. They're still useful if they're fed appropriately. The thing to remember with any feed that you buy, sweet feed, pellet, mix, whatever you want to call it, it's only as good as the ingredients that have been put together, and they have to be blended in the right proportions and under the right circumstances. Cooked or uncooked can make a difference, particularly to digestibility and certainly to palatability. So the heyday of the sweet feed we're on the downside, but I don't think they will go away entirely.